Hi Cece, welcome to week 13 of your timeline. We're starting a whole new era in the timeline, a new age. We're calling it the Age of Exploration. I'm going to step away from ASL and go back to one of our old school CC signs because it's just so fitting for this one. And that is just going to be we're looking this way and we're looking that way. So it's Age of Exploration. Now, I think the dates are important. Of course, they are not required to achieve Memory Master status, but I think they're useful and fun to know. So I am going to show you the ASL for circa 1400 to circa 1600. To create the sign for 14, take your 4, turn it toward you, and make sure the fingers aren't splayed out like this. That should be a tight 4, and you're going to blink it toward yourself 2 times, just like the 2 syllables in the word 14. So it looks like this, 14. And many of you by now, I'm sure, know how we're going to do the sign for 100. It's a good old Roman numeral. Can you do it before I get to it? Yes, it's a C. This is the sign for 100. Altogether, that's 1400. The sign for 16 is kind of sassy and fun, just like a 16-year-old. You're going to first make a 6, connect your pinky and your thumb, start with it facing toward you, just like we always say, and then you're going to flick it out toward the viewer twice, just like the 2 syllables in 16. So it looks like this, 16, and then 100, 100. So when we put it all together, we have circa 1400 to circa 1600. Our first card is Prince Henry founds the School of Navigation. Now, what was he a prince of? Prince Henry was a prince of Portugal. And if you know your geography, then you know that Portugal is on the very edge of Spain. And if you were to head straight down from Portugal on the map, you would run into, correct, Africa. Now, Portugal and many other countries had been trying to sail their way around that west coast of Africa for a very long time. But there'd been very little success. First of all, it was an incredibly long journey, but there was something that made it more difficult than just length. And the current was so strong that once ships had made it down past the coast of West Africa, they could never turn around and go back up north again. They just got stranded. This area was so treacherous that Arabic map makers who were famous for their skills and who had mapped out much of the world, when they reached a certain point around the west coast of Africa, they would just label it Dark Seas or the Sea of Darkness. And it was believed that serpents lived there and that these were the things keeping ships from returning back home. We know now that that dark sea, that Sea of Darkness, was actually anything south of 27 degrees north latitude. There was a really amazing discovery that happened around this time in the Age of Exploration that allowed ships to make it back home, and it was high sea sailing. If you've ever heard someone say, I sailed the high seas, what that means is they sailed out far away from land, where you couldn't even see the land. Before we got really good at nautical navigation and navigating by the stars, the best way to navigate was to keep land in sight. Then you could navigate by major mountains, major bays that you noticed, but it was all connected to the land. When you moved out far away from the land, that was much more treacherous, much more dangerous, and they called that high sea sailing. It was eventually discovered that if you did high sea sailing, if you moved out far away from the land near the west coast of Africa, you could finally catch the prevailing winds, and you could sail back up and then turn and come back in home to places like Portugal. Now, discoveries like that were only possible because people like Prince Henry took the matter so seriously. He gathered scientists, navigators, map makers, sailors, and he had them share information. His palace had the first observatory in Portugal. He was obsessed with discovery and science and sailing. Fun fact, one other really interesting thing about Prince Henry is that he was the commander of the Order of Christ. Now, that was an old order of the Knights Templar, or Knights Templar, based on which country you're in. They were this ancient Christian order of knights, and many people believe in all kinds of conspiracy theories or fun mysteries about them, that they did all kinds of secretive things to try to forward and advance the ideals of Christ. Prince Henry was incredibly successful at his school of navigation. By the time he died, they had mapped much of the west coast, and they had defeated the Muslims, who were the enemies of Portugal at the time, and they had spread Christianity all around Africa. And many people said he spread all that Christianity because of being a commander of the Knights Templar, or Knights Templar. Portugal continued to explore Africa after his death and to colonize Africa, but by the time he died, his sailors had reached as far south as Liberia, which is pretty good. One thing I should mention is that some scholars think the whole School of Navigation thing has been kind of blown out of proportion, that it was never an official thing with a name like that. That it just happened to be that Prince Henry was really fascinated by these things, and so he brought scholars to his court and he hired sailors in his court, and that it was much more of like a military force than it was this amazing force of academics. That's just to let you in on the fact that there's a bit of academic controversy. But what's not controversial is that Prince Henry absolutely achieved his nautical dreams. To create the sign for Prince Henry Founds the School of Navigation, we're first going to make an ASL P. You touch your thumb to your middle finger, like this, and you cock it downward. P. So we're going to take that P and draw a royal sash from our shoulder down to our hip. So it's Prince Henry. Then I'm going to do a mix of ASL and the CC signs. If we do every word in this sign in ASL, it'll just be too long and way too awkward. But I think the word school is really important and it's something that might be useful. To make the sign for school, you take your flat hand, your non-dominant hand, and you're going to tap the hand twice. See where I am? You'll tap it twice. Now don't mix this up with the sign for paper. It's just down, as if to say, do your schoolwork. So school. And for navigation, we're going to do a pointer finger with that hand that's already there and just navigate like a compass telling us which way we're going. So all together it will be Prince Henry founds the School of Navigation. Our next timeline card is slave trade in Africa. Just keeping things fun and easy to discuss. Slavery was common in ancient Africa, as it was in much of the ancient world, and there are several reasons for this. First of all, much of Africa consisted of separate tribes that were warring against each other, so they would enslave each other. Secondly, Africa had been conquered so many times by conquerors who used the Africans as slaves. Africa had been conquered by the Romans, who enslaved the Africans, and then by the Muslims, who enslaved the Africans. So for various complex reasons, there was a, for lack of a better word, thriving slave market in Africa in the 1400s. Ibn Battuta, a famous scholar who visited Mali in the 1400s, said that the people there would compete with each other to see who had the most slaves, and that when he arrived, he was given a little boy as a hospitality gift. There are several different kinds of slavery that you might hear of. One is chattel slavery. That's the, I guess you'd say, the worst one. And that is the category of slavery where this human being is considered a piece of property and you're allowed to treat them however you want and do whatever you want with them. Next, there's domestic slavery, which implies more that this person who was enslaved became part of your household. They might have children who grew up to be part of the lineage, and they might become part of your community. In fact, in much of Africa, it was illegal to own land, but it wasn't illegal to own slaves. So one of the ways that families built up their reputation, their clout, and their lineage was just to have more people, more slaves than anyone else. There's also debt bondage. That's when a person has been sold to pay off a specific debt, either by someone else to pay off their debt, or they're working to pay off their own debt. There's military slavery, in which you are captured and forced to serve in the military. And there's also human sacrifice, which was common in Africa in this period, in fact, all the way up until the 1800s. At the annual customs of Dahomey, between 500 and 4,000 enslaved people would be sacrificed in a single day. We also had the Barbary slave trade, in which Barbary pirates, Muslim pirates, would go searching for European or Christian ships. When they captured a ship, they would steal everything of value on board, including the human beings, and they would then sell those human beings into slavery. Well, correction, they would sell anyone who couldn't be used to raise a ransom and who wouldn't convert to Islam. That's how you know it's real faith, when you convert to not be enslaved. So there is a huge, long history of enslaved white people in the Muslim world that sometimes doesn't get talked about when we discuss this issue. But the slave trade we're talking about here in our timeline card is specifically the Atlantic or transatlantic slave trade. And this begins in about 1444, when the first Portuguese ships show up in Africa and find this thriving slave market economy and start taking those enslaved people back to Europe across the ocean. This went on for generations. It won't be stopped until so much further down in our timeline. And it's tricky to sort of pinpoint who stops it first. Is it the Quaker colony in Pennsylvania that first declares it illegal before America is even a country? Because many countries began to pass laws as far back as the early 1700s, maybe even before that. They would sort of limit the slave trade. They would say, you can't enslave Africans, but the Native Americans are okay. Or they would say, you can't enslave Native Americans, but the ones who are already working for you are okay. As far as officially ending it, that doesn't happen until the 1800s. Slavery was and is a horrible, barbaric practice. I say is because slavery is still happening today. In 2021, it was estimated that 50 million people around the world were enslaved. The 10 countries with the highest number of enslaved people today are 10, Kuwait, 9, Afghanistan, 8, Russia, 7, the United Arab Emirates, 6, Tajikistan, 5, Turkey, 4, Saudi Arabia, 3, Mauritania, 2, Eritrea, 1, North Korea. This isn't the place for me to get on a huge soapbox about slavery, nor am I a person who has earned that right. But I hope we all care about the modern slavery that is still happening, and I hope we do what we can to end it by paying attention to where we get our products, where they're made, and who makes them. Because I think we can all agree a world without slavery would be a much more beautiful place. Creating the sign for this one is tricky. In ASL, slave would actually be up here and moving from side to side, but it happens so quickly in the music that we don't actually have time to make that sign. So I'm going to suggest we just do a downward thing like this, slave, and then our hands are well positioned to do the sign for trade, which is you take some, I take some. Trade. Slave trade in Africa, and you'll just kind of get to the end of Africa. You're going to take your fingers and trace the shape of the continent of Africa. So altogether, that's slave trade in Africa. That sign for Africa, you can do it out in front like this. You can also do it across your face. And remember, that way it sort of means beautiful Africa. But for now, for this time, I just say, let's do this one. That's it. Next, we have an invention that truly changed the world, Gutenberg's printing press. In 1440, Gutenberg was a German goldsmith. So he was used to working with teeny tiny pieces of metal for jewelry and for settings and book fasteners and things like that. Oh, it's still recording. And that led him to have some very clever ideas regarding printing. Before Gutenberg's printing press, we had very few options as far as how to make copies of text and share them with other people. You could copy them out by hand, in which case you could only do a few pages in a day. These were very big pages with very tiny writing. So a few pages in a day, if by hand. You could use a hand press or a screw press, and in that case you could get about 40 pages done in a day. But once Gutenberg perfected his printing press, you could do 3,600 pages in a single workday. How did he do it? It was by making tiny movable type and separating the idea that first you have to get your letters set up, your typeset, and then you do the printing. So you would move your tiny little letters around, get them exactly the way you wanted them in the plate, and then print copy after copy after copy. This invention revolutionized so many areas of life. First, it meant more people could have access to religious materials. Bibles could be printed, and regular people could own them. And maybe not everybody, but they weren't just books that were kept chained up in churches that had been hand-copied. You could have a Bible in your family, and you'd pass it down through the generations. Next, it revolutionized who could have access to educational materials in general. Now more people could learn to read and have things to read. And lastly, it revolutionized how we got our news, because the news could be printed out once a week, once a day. In fact, we still call the news the press. And that takes us all the way back to Gutenberg's printing press. Creating the sign for this one is a little tricky. They all start the same way, with an ASL G, like this, little pinch your fingers. But after that, if you're going to stick to straight ASL, it's sort of tricky. You can maybe take the G and do printing like this, and then do the sign for machine. Then the way most CC families do it is you do the G for Gutenberg, and then you do printing press. None of those really look like the printing press to me, and it was so different and so big and so revolutionary that I kind of want to do my own sign. I'm sorry. So I think we should do Gutenberg's printing press and go all the way down and pop back up because it was that big a deal. So all together we have Gutenberg's printing press. That's it. Next we have Songhai in Africa. And this is one of the most vast empires ever known on the African continent. The roots of the Songhai go back to ancient times, but the recorded history of the empire starts in about the 11th and 12th century. So what we would think of as medieval times is when this empire was founded. And it gets really, really big and big. Each generation conquers more territory and it spreads and spreads until it really peaks right about now in our timeline. The Songhai were eventually conquered and the empire was destroyed in about 1591. So here's the story. In one of our last cards, I mentioned the visiting scholar Ibn Battuta. He traveled all over Africa, and when he reached the Songhai region, he was so impressed. He said it was the most vast, the most fertile land he'd seen, and also that they had cucumbers. He was really impressed by the cucumber. So every time you have a cucumber, please remember the Songhai. They had gold, they had people, they had power. One of the really prominent kings of this era was Songhai Ali. He was a conqueror at heart, and he also sort of looked down on academics and scholars. He cared much more about the military. You might remember we talked a long time ago about Timbuktu, how it was this African center of learning, and all the scholars flocked there. Well, Ali was sort of against the scholars. He created policies against them. I couldn't find an indication of what these policies were, but you definitely did not want to be a Timbuktu scholar under the authority of Songhai Ali. Eventually, he invaded and took over Timbuktu, and they had tried to escape. Many people fled. A lot of the scholars fled Timbuktu. Those who were left behind were slaughtered. Now, the ruler after him expanded the military until there was a permanently standing military corps of warriors, and those warriors were used to conquer more and more and more territory. The Songhai was vast. One of their other really notable kings was Askia the Great. He was a devout religious man. He loved scholars. He loved religious texts. He founded schools and mosques so that students could go to Islamic schools all over the empire. He captured all the nearby salt mines so that now his empire was in charge of the salt trade, which was hugely profitable. Salt made it possible to preserve meat, go on long journeys, survive a hard winter. It was an incredibly useful, even vital commodity. One really interesting thing about him is that he did not force people to convert to Islam. All of his policies were Islamic. He had Islamic schools available, but if a people group was captured, they had to obey the laws, but they were not forced to say that they were Muslims. I just think he seems like a wonderful leader. But I guess his kids didn't agree. His children wanted one of them to rule sooner and to take over. They revolted against him, and that led to a weakening of the empire. But what really brought down the Songhai Empire was the Moroccans and cattle. Let me explain. The Moroccans had been fighting an extended war against the Portuguese. Now, at one point, the battle got so fierce, and the Moroccans did win that exchange. They fought off the Portuguese, but at that point, all of their resources were depleted. They were out of money, they were out of soldiers, they were just out of luck. So they decided, let's go invade the Songhai. In 1591, they invaded the country, stole back the salt mines, stole all the gold they could find, and then enslaved all the Songhai people. And sadly and memorably, one of the things that led to their victory is that while the two armies were getting ready to face off, some of the gunpowder went off on the Moroccan side, and it caused a stampede, and cattle rushed into the Songhai army and just trampled them. So they were defeated by both the Moroccans and cattle. There's some history for you. Because we're talking about the Songhai, and because they were famous for their salt mines, we're going to use an ASL S to start off the sign for this card. Just take your fist and cross your thumb over your other fingers. Songhai. And I think it would be kind of funny if we take it up. So, Songhai. Now, to read the sign for Africa, as usual, you've got at least two choices, probably more than that. ASL can be quite creative. So you can either do tracing the shape in front of you or doing it near your face, like beautiful Africa. I'm going to do it in front just to stay consistent. So you've got, all together, Songhai in Africa. That's it. Next we have Tsar Ivan the Great of Russia. Now he was Ivan the Third. There had been many Ivans, and there were many Ivans after him, which is why it's important to differentiate him in some way, and we do that with the Great. An interesting fact about him, though, is that he wasn't known as the Tsar to most of his own people. He sort of reserved that term for negotiations with foreign powers to sound very authoritative and impressive with them. Back at home, he was known as the Grand Prince. As just a regular prince, the son of the king, Ivan had been very influential in Russia, in Moscow, because his father had been blind, so he acted as a regent and helped his father through the end of his reign. He himself reigned from 1462 to 1505. That's 43 years as Tsar, or Grand Prince, which makes it the second longest reign anyone's ever had in Russia. The only person to beat that record was his own grandson. If you only remember one thing about Ivan the Great, you should remember that he unified Russia. Prior to this, Russia was made up of a bunch of city-states who all competed against each other and didn't necessarily trust each other. After Ivan, Russia was fairly centralized and unified. Several groups fought against Ivan in his attempts to gain power and to consolidate the vast region of Russia. The big ones were Novgorod. It just sounds magical. They had their own area of power and they opposed Ivan. The other big place that opposed him was Lithuania. Now, some people were really upset about Lithuania trying to gain power because they were Catholic, more traditionally Catholic, whereas Ivan's territory in Moscow was Eastern Orthodox. Now remember, there are three major branches of Christianity, and they have very different beliefs despite the fact that they're all Christians. You have the Roman Catholic, the Eastern Orthodox, and the Protestant. And several different denominations fall under each of those three big sections, but never the train, the twain, the thrain. Those three don't go together. They don't mix well. With Lithuania being Roman Catholic and Moscow being Eastern Orthodox, they were just sort of set up to butt heads with each other. Ultimately, Ivan triumphed over Lithuania, and he just about wiped out the Novgorod, which is why you have never heard of them. It's interesting to note how close Ivan the Great is in the timeline to the Songhai of Africa. So at the same time that the Songhai were expanding their empire across generations, Ivan the Great was expanding his empire, but he pretty much just did it in one generation. It was pretty much just him. Now, he did have 4 brothers, and all of them believed they should have land and power and be princes in their own right. Ivan disagreed and also wanted their land. He wanted all the land that the princes held to pass back to whomever was Grand Prince after they died. Ivan fought with his brothers consistently throughout his life about this land issue. So one of the brothers died of natural causes, we think, and Ivan took his land. The second brother left the land to Ivan in his will. I think he was just tired of fighting. Brothers 3 and 4 really battled him out over this, and they tried to make alliances with Lithuania. It was really bad. One of them was thrown in prison, died in prison, and then Ivan took his land. And the fourth one died of natural causes, left the land to his sons, and when they died, Ivan took the land. Or at least the Grand Prince took the land. One of the big things the Novgorod were fighting for were fur trading rights. It was just a hugely lucrative Russian industry, and Ivan won that too. Ivan basically conquered territory by any means necessary. He would get it through military conquest. He would purchase it. He would marry into it. Whatever it took. Now, one of the big interesting things to keep in mind that was going on culturally during this time is the fall of Constantinople. This happened in 1453, only about 10 years before Ivan officially became Grand Prince, but remember he was regent before that. With the fall of Constantinople, everyone who cares about the Eastern Orthodox Church is thinking, where's our power center now? Where do we go now? Where's our great city? Where's like the house of our religion and the great city of our religion? Who are we? Where are we? Maybe you're in Moscow. At least that was the idea. And that's why Ivan called Moscow the Third Rome. Gradually, Moscow, the center of Ivan's territory, his capital city, it became more and more Byzantine in style, in its clothing, in its etiquette, and even in its symbolism. It adopted the double-headed eagle as one of its major symbols. You can look at paintings done of this era, and Ivan always looks like a great Turkish prince. And it wasn't just that Ivan conquered land and that he became the new Rome and gave everyone these great symbols. It was also what he did with the lands that he conquered. He wanted to beautify and bring back the glory days of the Byzantine Empire. He invited artists, architects, artisans to come to Moscow. He rebuilt the Kremlin and expanded it with beautiful palaces and bell towers. Now, we call him Ivan the Great, but there were a couple things about him that weren't so great. There's at least one that's been passed down through history that we remember him for that was quite negative, and that is the way he treated poorer people. In particular, he initiated an exit fee for anyone who was leaving the land of their landlord. So if you wanted to go off to try something else, or start a new life, or emigrate to a different country, or just even move in with family, you had to pay this huge fee to your landlord to be allowed to go. People couldn't pay the fee, so they were stuck. So people say that Ivan, in doing this, he paved the way for serfdom, which led to a lot of misery. So it wasn't all great. There's one more thing that Ivan did that really sealed his reputation as being the Great. And that is that he finally got rid of the Khans, the masters of the golden hordes, who had been demanding tribute from his people for generations. There's a famous story, and it's apocryphal, it didn't really happen, but you'll often see it depicted in paintings, that the Khan sent a letter to Ivan demanding payment, demanding his tribute. Basically, if you give us this money, then we won't attack you. And Ivan, in this apocryphal story, tears up the letter and throws it on the ground. We don't actually need apocryphal stories about tearing up letters, because what Ivan really did is that impressive. His army faced off against the army of the Khan across two sides of a river. And gradually, Ivan's army sent them running, and they retreated back into the steppes. That was such a big deal and such a point of pride for all of Russia. So that's why, to this day, he's still known as Ivan the Great. To create this sign, we're going to start with an I, an ASLI, and that's just a pinky, Ivan, and then we're going to do great, or a sort of celebration movement, and that's pumping up here, yeah. And for Russia, you can't quite see what I'm doing, but I'm taking two hands like this and just tapping them against my hips. And that's the sign for Russia. So we're looking for Tsar Ivan the Great of Russia. Or maybe you could go a little slowly because of the way the music works. Russia. Yeah, that works better. So all together we've got Tsar Ivan the Great of Russia. And that's it. Our last card this week is the Spanish Inquisition. Bet you weren't expecting that. Nobody ever does. And this was started in 1478 by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. Yes, that King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, the ones who funded Columbus in his journey. So I bet you can tell what one of the next things in the timeline will be. They are the same people who started the Spanish Inquisition. Prior to that, there had been other Inquisitions. There was the Roman Inquisition, there was the Portuguese Inquisition, and then the Spanish Inquisition. So what's an Inquisition? Basically, we're talking about a traveling tribunal, a relatively small group of judges who went from town to town, province to province, laying down the law, looking especially for heretics, people who had done something to undermine the Catholic faith. Now, why was this such a big deal? Why were they bothering to look for heretics? A couple reasons, and this can get quite complex, so I'll just try to give you a few basic facts. One of them is that any speaking against Catholicism was considered potentially treasonous. And that is because Spain was under attack for much of its history from Muslim forces, and they had come up against the Muslims, expelled them from Spain, they'd come back to Spain. These are the Moors. They also were dealing with major immigration from Jewish populations. Much of the fear in Spain was in particular against the Muslims. They would try to gradually work their way back into Spain and gradually cause some kind of traitorous plan to foment. The idea was that Muslims would get influence and then use their influence to topple the monarchy. If you imagine Spain on the map, the very bottom portion that begins to touch Africa, that portion is known as the Iberian Peninsula. And for a long time, the Iberian Peninsula was controlled by Muslim forces. In this period, Spain had succeeded in getting the land back, but that also meant that the Kingdom of Spain was suddenly flooded with new Muslim inhabitants. I mean, the land hadn't just been empty. And the big question in Spain was, what do we do with all the people who live here? They have a completely different culture from us, a culture that we've just been at war with. Do we kick them all out? Do we let some stay? Many of them were kicked out, but anybody who agreed to convert to Catholicism was allowed to stay. The same thing was true for the Jews in the region. If they said they would convert away from Judaism to Catholicism, they were allowed to stay. So thousands upon thousands of people did this. But the big question was, have they really converted? Or are they secretly still Muslims and Jews who are working in secret to sort of undermine the government? Basically, the Inquisition was looking for that. There was even a special name applied to these new converts or new Christians. They were conversos, and the Inquisition was primarily concerned with them. So how did the Inquisition work? Basically, they would arrive in a city or a territory. Once they arrived, they would declare an edict of grace. And this edict meant you had about 30 or 40 days to come in and confess, to give yourself over to the Inquisition. If you did that, you would avoid the steepest punishments, and many people did that. However, this is where it gets especially controversial. One of the key factors in coming in and confessing and presenting yourself was, one, you would do a public penance, and two, you would hand over other conspirators. You would name other people who deserved to be captured by the Inquisition. I'm sure you can see where this is going. People often named those with whom they had conflict or long-standing jealousies, not necessarily those who were heretics and trying to overthrow the crown. Now, if you were accused by someone during this Edict of Grace period, you were just thrown into prison, and you weren't allowed to be told who had accused you. So even if it was someone with whom you had a very obvious conflict, there was just nothing you could do to defend yourself against them. It was completely anonymous. According to some writers, you weren't even told what you'd been accused of, and you just stayed in prison for up to 2 years until they finally brought you to trial. But most agree that people were told what they'd been accused of. Now, while you were in prison, all your property was confiscated and sold. Any family living on that property was suddenly on the streets and in dire straits, and there was nothing they could do about it. And this is what led to the very common public opinion that the Inquisition only persecuted and found heretics among the wealthy. There's one case where all the land and goods confiscated from a specific town was used to fund a new royal palace. In some ways, the Inquisition was quite modern and doesn't deserve the reputation it has in modern culture. For example, you were given a trial, you were even assigned someone who was sort of your defending lawyer, although that person came from the Inquisition, so they were mostly there to encourage you to confess. But still, it was a trial where everything anyone said was written down on both sides, and both sides were allowed to testify and present their evidence, and you were allowed to make a defense. Many countries took hundreds of more years to get to that point where citizens were allowed to just have a fair trial. So the Inquisition's got that going for it. Did they torture people? Yes. However, they were actually guilty of much less torture than other European courts. For example, under most monarchies in Europe, they were allowed to torture you as much as they wanted, with whatever they wanted, for as long as they wanted to get whatever they wanted. But the Inquisition actually had very strict rules about when you were allowed to use torture. It was basically only when they were already certain of your guilt, but they had asked you to give up like details of the plan or where you met or the other conspirators who were with you. So it was only used as a means to get information, not to punish someone. There were also rules about what they were allowed to use to torture someone, how much they could hurt them. For example, they weren't allowed to maim you. They couldn't ever leave you with unable to use one of your hands or one of your feet or one of your legs. No maiming. They also couldn't draw blood. So don't get me wrong, there's still horrible things you can do to a person without, maiming them or drawing blood. But the point is, they had rules, very strict rules. They weren't just applying torture willy-nilly. And in many ways, the Inquisition was seen as more fair. You would get better treatment under the Inquisition than you would in many other courts. For example, Philip III, there's a story that people confessed under him or claimed to be Catholics just so they could get transferred to the Inquisition because the Inquisition would deal with them less harshly. So here are the possible outcomes if you are taken before the Spanish Inquisition. 1, they can acquit you, decide you're just not guilty. Didn't happen a lot, but it did happen. 2, they could sentence you to public penance. In particular, they had this big ceremony called the auto de fe, or the Act of Faith, where you would be sort of paraded through the public streets wearing a tall pointed dunce cap. That cap is called a capirote, and it was worn by penitents. A paper version of it was put on people to humiliate them in public during public penance. And the idea behind the cap is that all attention is taken from you and pointed toward God. But of course, it does draw all the attention to you, so that feels counterproductive. Later on in history, this very serious piece of clothing used in big public ceremonies of penance by the Spanish Inquisition, later on, school teachers would use it to humiliate children, and they'd say, "You're the dunce of the day," and make them wear a little pointed cap. I find it strange that that symbolic clothing item went through so many changes in its history and sort of held on for so long. Weird. Another possible outcome is that they could reconcile you, which basically means you did your penance, you said you were sorry, now you're back in the faith and you're okay. And the last possibility, which is the worst one, has the best sounding name. It was called relaxation. To be relaxed was to be released back under the king's authority. Because one important thing about the Inquisition is they did not have the power to kill anyone. Only the monarch could do that. So if the Inquisition said, "You're guilty, we're done with you, we're relaxing you, we're sending you to the king," you were basically being sent to your death. Along with really sort of targeting the wealthy, people who had something to confiscate, the Inquisition also especially targeted those who lived near the borders of Spanish territory. These are the people who could be influenced by outsiders, could be harboring spies. And these sort of plots against the king and spies and all that was real. It was really going on. There were plots to overthrow the monarch all the time in England, Spain, France. So this wasn't an entirely paranoid fear on the part of Ferdinand and Isabella. So the Inquisition was there to sort of stop an invasion or stop a plot or treason before it took root. Much of the imagery that we associate with the Spanish Inquisition is just sort of wrong. And we think this is partly because it comes from books written like 100 years later, maybe 200 years later, by Protestants. They had every reason to vilify and see this Inquisition as especially horrible. Ultimately, Protestants were not the primary victims of the Spanish Inquisition, partly because there were almost no Protestants in Spain. It just wasn't a thing. In fact, the majority of the people who were detained by the Inquisition, questioned, tortured, imprisoned, and then maybe relaxed, they were Jews and Muslims, not Protestants. Another bit of imagery we tend to get wrong is the burning at the stake. They weren't allowed to kill anyone. Now, while it's true they would find someone guilty and then send them off to the king, it wasn't the Inquisition itself doing the burning. Maybe that feels like a moot point if you're the person getting burned at the stake, but it is a point. The Inquisition changed form several times, became harsher toward one group of people or more lenient on certain things as it aged, but it wasn't officially disbanded until 1834. It's really tricky to get estimates of how many people in total were investigated by the Inquisition, but it looks like somewhere in the neighborhood of 150,000 were questioned, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 were relaxed and sent to the king. That number is much lower than just the number of people persecuted for witchcraft during a very narrow witchcraft scare in Europe. So while I'm certainly not here to defend the Inquisition, it is true that some of the imagery that's been passed down about it isn't quite accurate. And that's important to know. To create the sign for this card, we're going to start with one of the signs for Spain. We'll do 2 X's, we'll hook them, sort of like we're grabbing the attachments of a cape, like those beautiful matador capes. You hook them, and then you hook them together. Spanish, and since the Inquisition was a courtroom, we're going to do that old Western-style gavel coming down. That's a sign that leaves out a lot of the nuance of what the Inquisition was and what they did, but I think it still works. So altogether, that's the Spanish Inquisition. That's it. Ready to see it all put together? 3, 2, 1, go!
In Africa, Gutenberg's printing press, Songhai in Africa, Czar in the grain of Russia, Spanish Inquisition, Columbus sails to the Caribbean.
Okay, here we go. Timeline, this is my timeline. Timeline, this is my timeline. Timeline, timeline. We'll start at the beginning of the ages. Age of ancient empires, creation to circa 450 AD. Creation and the fall, the flood and the Tower of Babel, Mesopotamia and Sumer, Egyptians. 3000 BC, 3000 BC. Indus River Valley civilization, Minoans and Mycenaeans. 7 wonders of the ancient world, patriarchs of Israel. 2000 BC, 2000 BC, Hittites and Canaanites, Kush, Assyrians, Babylonians, China, Shang Dynasty, Hinduism in India, Phoenicians and the alphabet, Olmecs of Mesoamerica, Israel Israelite exodus and desert wandering, Israelite conquest and judges, Greek dark ages, Israel's united kingdom. 1000 BC, 1000 BC, early Native Americans. Israel divides into two kingdoms, Homer and Hesiod. Rome founded by Romulus and Remus. Israel falls to Assyria, Assyria falls to Babylon. Lao Tzu, Confucius, Buddha. Judah falls to Babylon, temple destroyed. Babylon falls to Persia, Jews return and rebuild the temple. Roman Republic, golden age of Greece, Peloponnesian wars. Persia falls to Alexander the Great. India's Mauryan Empire, Mayans of Mesoamerica, Punic Wars, Rome conquers Greece. Roman dictator Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus and the Pax Romana, John the Baptist, Jesus the Messiah. Year 1 AD, year 1 AD, year 1 AD, Pentecost and the early church. Persecution spread the gospel. Herod's temple destroyed by Titus. Diocletian divides the Roman Empire. Constantine legalizes Christianity. India's Gupta dynasty. Council of Nicaea, Augustine of Hippo. Jerome completes the Vulgate. Visigoths at Rome. The Middle Ages, circa 450 to circa 1500. Council of Chalcedon, Western Roman Empire falls to barbarians.
500 AD, 500 AD.
Once is enough. Ah!
Byzantine Emperor Justinian.
Benedict and monasticism. Mohammed founds Islam.
Clans in early Ghana in Africa. Franks defeat Muslims at the Battle of Tours.
Golden age of Islam. Ooh.
Vikings raid and trade. Japan's imperial. Charlemagne crowned Emperor of Europe. Alfred the Great of England. Eric the Red and Leif Erikson, Norse explorers. Vladimir the First of Kiev, Byzantine Emperor Basil II. 1000 AD, 1000 AD. East-West schism of the church, Norman conquest and feudalism in Europe. The Crusades in Zimbabwe and early Mali in Africa. Aztecs of Mesoamerica, Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas, Japan's shoguns, Incas of South America. Genghis Khan rules the Mongols. England's Magna Carta. Ottoman Empire, Marco Polo's journey to China. 100 Years' War and Black Death. The Renaissance, China's
founds, school of navigation, slave trade in Africa. Gutenberg's printing press, Songhai in Africa. Czar Ivan the Great of Russia, the Spanish Inquisition. Columbus sails to the Caribbean. 1580, age of absolute monarchs.
Circa 1500 to circa 1800.
Protestant Reformation, Spanish conquistadors in the Americas. Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, Council of Trent. The Baroque period of the arts, Japan's isolation. Jamestown and Plymouth colony founded. Age of Enlightenment, circa 1650 to circa 1800. Hudson's Bay Company, first great awakening. Classical period of the arts, the 7 Years' War. Age of industry, circa 1760 to circa 1969. James Cook sails to Australia and Antarctica. American Revolution and General George Washington. Madison's Constitution and the Bill of Rights. French Revolution, Second Great Awakening. Louisiana Purchase and Lewis and Clark Expedition. Napoleon crowned Emperor of France. Liberation of South America. The War of 1812, the Missouri Compromise. Immigrants flock to America. The Monroe Doctrine, romantic period of the arts. Cherokee Trail of Tears, U.S. westward expansion.
Marx publishes the Communist Manifesto.
The Compromise of 1850 and the Dred Scott Decision. U.S. restores trade with Japan. British Queen Victoria's rule over India. Darwin publishes
The Origin of Species.
Lincoln's War between the states, reconstruction of the southern states, dominion of Canada. Otto von Bismarck unifies Germany. Wars in Africa, the Spanish-American War. The Progressive Era, Australia becomes a commonwealth. Mexican Revolution, World War I and President Wilson. Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. U.S. evangelist Billy Graham. Modern period of the arts, the Great Depression and the New Deal. World War II and President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Stalin of the USSR and the Katyn Massacre.
The United Nations formed. The Cold War. Gandhi and India's independence. Jewish state established. Mao and communist victory in China. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Korean War.
Martin Luther King Jr.
pioneer in the civil rights movement.
Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, missionaries to Ecuador, the Antarctic Treaty, the Vietnam War. U.S. astronauts walk on the moon.
On the LNP. Yeah.
Age of information and globalization, circa 1970 to the present. Watergate, President Nixon resigns.
The best is au revoir.
Fall of communism in Eastern Europe. European Union formed. Apartheid abolished in South Africa. 2000 AD, 2000 AD, September 11th, 2001.
Our fellow citizens are waiting.
Rising tide of freedom, rising tide